cursed doll. In a small town, lost among endless fields, there lived a girl named Lucy. She had always dreamed of a doll that would become her best friend. On her 10th birthday, her dream came true. Her grandmother gave her an antique doll with long, flowing hair and bright, expressive eyes. The doll was elegantly dressed in a fluffy dress, and its face radiated kindness and innocence. "Be careful with it," her grandmother said softly, watching as Lucy hugged the doll excitedly. "This doll has a story of its own." Lucy didn't pay much attention to that. She sat down on the floor, smoothed the doll's skirt, and began to play. With each passing day, the doll became more and more a part of her life. Lucy named her Mila, and they spent long hours together playing various games. But one day, when Lucy woke up in the morning, she noticed that Mila was standing at the edge of her bed. Although she had left her sitting on the shelf, Lucy's heart began to race. "Mila, you were just on the shelf!" Lucy exclaimed. But the doll only stared at her silently. At first, Lucy thought it was just her imagination, but soon, other strange things began to happen. Mila not only changed positions, but also whispered to her at night when Lucy couldn't sleep. It was as if someone behind her was calling her name. The girl felt fear, but at the same time, she was drawn to the mystery. Days passed, and Lucy noticed that when she played with Mila, the doll started giving her suggestions on what to do. These were not just game tips, they were dangerous ideas. "Jump off the bed," or "show everyone what you can do," it whispered. Captivated by a strange excitement, Lucy obeyed. Her behavior became increasingly odd, and her parents began to worry about her well-being. One day, while playing with Mila outside, Lucy saw the doll slowly turn its head towards her friends. Terror gripped her when she realized that the doll was indeed watching them. The girl recoiled in panic, but Mila kept moving, even though Lucy didn't touch her. "Mila, this isn't funny!" she shouted, but the doll merely smirked with its silent face. After that, Lucy couldn't sleep. Every night, she heard the doll whispering in her ear, as if it knew that the girl was afraid of her. One day, unable to bear it any longer, she decided to take Mila back to her grandmother, hoping that she would know how to rid her of this nightmare. "Grandma, Mila is scaring me," Lucy said tearfully when she arrived at her grandmother's house. Her grandmother, hearing about the strange occurrences with the doll, frowned and asked Lucy to show her. When the girl returned with the doll, her grandmother examined it closely. She suddenly turned pale. "This doll, it belonged to a girl who went missing many years ago," the grandmother said quietly. "They say her spirit lives in it. And if we don't stop this, it could take you with it." Lucy felt a chill of terror as the doll began to tremble in her hands. She tried to break free, but the doll held her tightly. "We must perform a ritual to free her soul," her grandmother continued, gathering old candles and amulets. "You must be brave." Night fell, and the grandmother prepared everything for the ritual. Lucy stood before a mirror with the doll, her heart racing. The grandmother began to chant an incantation, and the room suddenly grew cold. The doll began to stir, seeming even more sinister. "I don't want to leave," it screamed piercingly, and its voice sounded like something other than a child's. At that moment, Lucy realized that she herself had to help this unfortunate soul. She closed her eyes and, gathering all her courage, recited the words she had heard from her grandmother. She knew she had to free the spirit of the girl bound to the doll, despite her fear. Suddenly, the room filled with bright light, and the doll quivered, as if it were fighting against an invisible force. "Forgive me," Lucy cried, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. "I want to help you." Suddenly, a piercing scream filled the air, and the doll went limp, losing its evil power. Lucy felt the light enveloping her, and then silence. The doll no longer moved. It was just a doll, lifeless and powerless. Lucy stood trembling, but felt an incredible sense of relief. She no longer felt fear. Her grandmother approached and hugged her, sighing with relief. "You were very brave, Lucy," her grandmother said, and the girl knew she would never be afraid again. The cursed doll remained in the past, and Lucy could finally return to her normal life. However, in the darkness of the room, The doll lay on the floor, its bright eyes still staring into nothingness, as if waiting for its next victim. It happened in winter, just before New Year's Eve. Frost had locked the village in ice, and a thick fog rolled over the ground. In a small house near the edge of the forest, an old widow named Martha was celebrating Christmas with her grandsons, 12-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old Edward. Their parents were delayed in the city, so Martha and the boys were left alone for the night. The evening was quiet. They sat by the fireplace, telling stories and baking cookies. When the clock struck midnight, Martha tucked the boys in and prepared to go to bed herself. The house was silent, except for the wind howling outside and the creaking of trees in the frost. But then Martha heard something, a crunch of snow outside the windows, as if someone was walking around the house. She tensed. Sounds like that in winter usually meant only one thing. Someone had come near their home. Approaching the window, she carefully looked outside and saw a dark figure in the fog, standing at the gate. The person was draped in a long coat, holding a strange, knotted staff. Martha couldn't make out their face, but she felt a chill run through her. She tried to convince herself it was just a passerby, but the dark figure didn't move. Instead, it turned its head towards the house and stood still, as if looking into the windows. Martha held her breath and took a step back. Just then, she heard a noise coming from the attic, like heavy footsteps crossing the creaky floorboards. Martha whipped around, but no one was supposed to be in the attic. It had been empty for years. She stood frozen, listening, and heard the noise again. Footsteps coming closer, all the way to the stairs. Realizing something was very wrong, Martha rushed to wake the boys. Whispering, she told them to dress quietly and murmured that they needed to get out of the house before someone came inside. Thomas and Edward, frightened by her expression, nodded silently. But as soon as they began to get dressed, the sound of footsteps shifted to a strange, soft tapping, as if someone were gently knocking on the walls, moving around the house. Then came a sinister scratching sound at the front door. Martha grabbed the boys by their hands and quietly led them to the pantry, where there was an old hidden passage that led out to the forest. They crept in, and Martha urged the boys into the tunnel, telling them to run to the neighbours. But she stayed at the door, afraid the stranger would notice them if he heard any noise. The sound at the door grew louder, as though someone was determined to break the lock. The door creaked, and suddenly it swung open into the cold night. Martha, holding her breath, peeked out from the pantry and saw the dark-coated figure step inside. Now his face was lit by the dim light of the fireplace. He had pale, ghostly features and empty eyes. In his hands, he held an old Christmas wreath woven from dry branches and rusted thorns, and on his fingers were several old rings that Martha recognized. They were worn by the old villagers who had died many years ago. He stopped in the middle of the room, casting his empty gaze around, and for a moment it seemed he caught someone's scent. But just as the figure stepped toward the pantry door, the wind suddenly howled through the house, as if something was stopping him. The stranger froze, glanced around the empty room, and as though hearing an unseen call, silently stepped back out, disappearing into the fog. Martha waited until his footsteps faded into the forest, and only then did she call the boys back. The neighbours later mentioned that over the past few years, they had started to notice strange things in the village, as if old spirits were beginning to return on Christmas Eve. Martha knew that she didn't want to celebrate this holiday alone anymore. Now she realised that the fog and the night could bring not only stray guests, but also those who had long left, yet still remembered their way back. My wife and I, along with our 2 kids, had always dreamed of a house in the countryside. When we finally found the asterisk house, we felt like it was a stroke of luck. It was an old house with a spacious garden surrounded by forest. The house looked solid and cozy, though it needed a bit of renovation. Despite its age, it had a certain charm. We moved in with excitement and started settling down. But soon, strange things started happening. Things that none of us expected. At first, it was minor stuff, Doors we left open would suddenly be closed, lights would flicker, even though the wiring had been checked before we bought the place. My wife and I brushed it off as fatigue after moving in, or just quirks of an old house, but the oddities didn't stop. They only got worse. One night, I woke up with the strange feeling that someone else was in the room. I listened carefully, but all I heard was a faint rustling, as if someone was barely breathing nearby. I looked over at my sleeping wife and decided it was just my imagination playing tricks on me due to exhaustion. But the next day, our oldest daughter said she'd heard whispering outside her door that night. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably the wind or sounds from the forest, but she insisted that the voice was saying her name. We noticed that the kids started looking more and more scared. They refused to sleep in their rooms, insisting on staying with us at night. Our son told me he had seen a shadow in the hallway moving toward his bedroom, and I saw for myself how he would wake up in a cold sweat at night. The more this happened, the stronger my feeling grew that something was wrong with that house. The last straw was when we returned home one evening after spending the day in town. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit with the smell of something burning, but there was no fire, no smoke, just this unbearable smell that made our eyes water. The next day, the kids found toys in the garden that my wife and I hadn't even bought. It felt like the house was somehow trying to scare us off or force us out. After that, my wife and I had a long talk and decided not to wait for something worse to happen. We packed our things and started looking for a new place, listing the old house for sale. Thankfully, a buyer came along quickly, and we didn't hesitate to accept their offer. After moving to a new town, we could finally breathe easy. Here in our new home, everything was calm and peaceful, and the kids were smiling again, sleeping soundly through the night. To this day, I remember that house with a slight chill down my spine. Maybe it was just our nerves, or our imaginations running wild, or the old house's atmosphere. But I'm glad we left, leaving that strange story behind us.